Hi, I'm Super Train Station H, and welcome to part 14 of Barrier Aggression, my analysis of select material from Autism Confidential, the National Council on Severe Autism's podcast series, mostly episode 36, where these three stooges of autism take an article about clinically diagnosed high-functioning autistic people who are protesting workplace discrimination and lie their asses off by presenting it as a hit piece about falsely autistic political partisans who are bent on invalidating and erasing the suffering and struggles of truly autistic people, the patients and children of NCSA members. That sounds extreme for me to say about them, but these panelists claim the autistic people in the article don't believe autism is a disability after reading only the first 9% of it, when the remaining 91% of it included those autistic people discussing aspects of their lives in which their autism is disabling. Almost as though the NCSA was afraid for their audience to hear potentially sympathetic aspects of their stories that would imply they were actually disabled. For this installment of my series, I'm pulling back the metaphorical curtain a bit and taking a more general view of silly things the NCSA members have said or done on this podcast and elsewhere. Now, with me being a cartoon dog, some of you might expect me to break out into song about how full of shit Jill Escher is. But of course, I would never do that. I may be a cartoon dog, but before that, I'm a YouTuber, so naturally, I'm gonna do a countdown list. Some of these items will seem like repeats at first, but it's because I may be making very different points on why these statements are stupid, or digging into different aspects of them. This list is not strictly hierarchical, but you could reason that in general the closer an item is to number 1, the more egregious I consider it, and it's a top 30 list. Anyway, 30 and 29, you can consider these runner-up items, because neither of these were said by NCSA members or guests on an NCSA-owned or connected platform, so you could think of these as dishonorable mentions.
Number 30.
The first runner-up on this list is Christine Romeo, the mother of Abby from the reality TV dating show Love on the Spectrum. And this entry covers her entire dumbass TikTok video that I covered in part 1 and partially part 2 of my series.
Okay, that's a big question. Why do I think that there's more people being diagnosed than years ago in the autism world? So the answer is the DSM-5. I think the diagnostic manual the doctors are using needs to be updated and changed, and real specific language needs to be created. Putting everybody on the autism spectrum to me is not helpful, and it's going to make everyone autistic soon, and it's diluted the very meaning of the spectrum in the first place.
Now, believe it or not, the fact that she disagreed with the DSM-5's merging of the former Asperger's syndrome into the new autism spectrum disorder diagnosis is not what earned her a spot on my shit list. What makes Christine a silly dumbass is her insistence that her daughter's DSM-4 era autism diagnosis was a real disability, but that Asperger's syndrome was not a disability. Christine's attempt to validate this bullshit is by explaining that her daughter needed years of occupational therapy and special education services that people with Asperger's don't need, proving the true severity of her daughter's disability and from her perspective.
Abby is neurodeficit, and a lot of people getting diagnosed today are neurodivergent. Neurodifferent means you didn't need speech and OT and all kinds of therapies and music therapy, and you didn't need an aide to go to school, and you didn't get pulled out of school to go to an autism school. You actually went to a typical school, and you had no support, and you were neurodifferent. So those people today are finally getting some acknowledgement, and I think that's a good thing, but I look at it as a different thing, because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference. You are neurodifferent, and Abby and people like Abby and Abby's programs were neurodeficit. Abby had 20 years of speech and OT and other services just to be able to talk like a neurodifferent person already can. So the answer is the DSM-5.
Christine was too busy propping up her daughter as the center stage main character of autism to learn that patients diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome in the DSM-4 era, under the same manual and same standards as her daughter, were also valid for consideration for the same therapies and services as her autistic daughter. Her daughter, Abby, who is an online celebrity thanks to her many reality TV dating show appearances and a strong TikTok presence, the latter of which would cause many people to consider Abby to be obviously faking autism for fame and attention at the expense of real autistic people. And I've seen people say this in support of NCSA articles and appearances by NCSA personalities like their president, Jill Escher. In this TikTok video and elsewhere, Abby's mom, Christine, has pushed for people that she considers too successful to be autistic to be removed from that category.
I think the diagnostic manual the doctors are using needs to be updated and changed, and real specific language needs to be created so that we can honor everybody and get them the help they need, but it's not the same thing. Putting everybody on the autism spectrum to me is not helpful, and it's going to make everyone autistic soon, and it's diluted the very meaning of the spectrum in the first place. But that doesn't mean that the neurodifferent brain doesn't need its own category, its own support, its own community, because I think it does. There you go.
Not realizing that according to many autism attack moms and autism attack doctors who share Christine's sentiments as she explained them, Christine's own daughter would be one of those falsely autistic people who can't possibly be legitimately disabled, let alone autistic. Now, Jill Escher considers autistic people who are able to have relationships, appear on television, and join sites like TikTok to have, as Jill describes it, TikTok autism, which according to Jill doesn't even constitute a neurodevelopmental disability.
They might be fully functional, independent adults. They might have college degrees. They might have successful careers. They might be married. They might have children. So the people at that very, very high end of autism who are super privileged, right?
And these aren't just any cases of autism. This isn't TikTok autism. You have to have a developmental disability to qualify for services in this system.
This completely ignores the fact that all autistic people, regardless of their support needs levels, must have a neurodevelopmental disability to be formally diagnosed with ASD in the first place.
And this isn't TikTok autism. You have to have a developmental disability to qualify for services in this system.
Best case scenario for Jill in that clip is that she's using California-specific support services eligibility criteria in programs specifically catered to high support needs autistic people, and is twisting those to imply to the uninformed public that people not served by those specific programs therefore aren't disabled. But it doesn't fucking work like that. But ironically enough, Jill wrote a positive review of Love on the Spectrum on the NCSA website, and she even leaves specific empathetic remarks regarding Abby. Now, my personal impression is that since Jill was introduced to Abby by watching a reality television show that was designed in its presentation to make the viewer build positive emotional attachment to the people featured. Jill ended up being sympathetic towards Abby, more so than she would have been if her first encounter with Abby was on TikTok in an online video where maybe she was talking about or recreating or demonstrating her stims, which is something that Abby has done in online videos. And that's something that Jill has shown open contempt for and has mocked in her online podcast appearances to ridicule the idea that these people could legitimately have these autistic characteristics.
Then what you have is this insane world where my son and daughter are lumped into the same disorder as these online people on Twitter who are like, or TikTok, who are like, look at me flapping.
Yes.
I'm so autistic. It's like, there's no real like Venn diagram overlap between like my kids and these TikTok people. You know, if I'm sitting here right now like this, instead of talking to you,
Yep.
that's not neurodiversity, that's a mental disorder, okay? And there's so much trivializing of autism. There's so much sugarcoating, you know, trying to recast it, right, as this kind of diversity. And it's just not.
Fuck you!
Neurodifferent means you didn't need speech and OT and all kinds of therapies and music therapy, and you didn't need an aide to go to school, and you didn't get pulled out of school to go to an autism school. You actually went to a typical school, and you had no support, and you were neurodifferent.
By the way, Christine, the fact that your daughter was withdrawn from a typical school to attend a disability-specific school to get her the help she needed for her personal manifestations of autistic characteristics and the disabling aspects of them doesn't prove how quote-unquote severe your daughter's case was. It proves that the school she was in previously wasn't equipped to provide occupational therapy, speech therapy, and assign aides to students and so on. Because it turns out that many so-called normal schools for non-autistic students are equipped to provide those things, and when appropriate, provide significant inclusion for students with autism and other disabilities with non-disabled typical students. But instead, Christine, you're using the fact that your daughter's original school wasn't equipped to serve her as a bragging point to hold over strangers, many with the same autistic traits as your daughter and in need of the same support, but who happened to be able to get the services they needed in the schools they were already at. Additionally, based on what you, Christine, have chosen to share about your daughter's experience as a disabled person, and based on a lot of things that Abby herself has shared on social media, whether or not she was diagnosed with autistic disorder or Asperger's disorder back in the DSM-4 era could have easily been a matter of where and by who the, practitioners that were performing the evaluation were, and their judgment on what could get Abby the services she needed while closing as few doors as possible to her in terms of operating to the extent that she was able to potentially within the non-disabled world. And that's the exact reason they later decided to merge the Asperger's and autism diagnoses back together. DSM doesn't stand for Disability Stage Mom, Christine, but that's what you are. Next.
Number 29.
Runner-up number 2 is another Christina, unrelated to the previous entry, on Peter Boghossian's podcast, who is a panelist alongside Jill Escher and the host himself. What earned Christina a spot are two remarks that are closely intertwined with each other, and one is her mistaken understanding that the DSM-4 era autistic disorder diagnoses, as a natural matter of fact, wouldn't have been able to engage with the neurodiversity paradigm or participate in autistic self-advocacy, and that self-advocacy in regards to autism was a newly invented concept that emerged due to the merging of the former Asperger's diagnosis into autism spectrum disorder in 2013 with the DSM-5.
the word autism.
That's the problem with we got rid of Asperger's as a condition, and it was sort of subsumed into the autism spectrum disorder umbrella in 2013, and that's where I think a lot of the issues we're currently having come from, because I think neurodiversity movement, that would have been fine if it was just Asperger's. Like, yes, you have a difference, not a disability. That's fine, but they're just sort of speaking on behalf of everybody. They lean into dysfunction online, is what I see, because they're in these online communities and they're observing other people, and other people will say like, "Well, you don't seem autistic," and so they just sort of like lean into whatever it is that they conceptualize autism to be, and they like become more dysfunctional and disabled because of it. That's my observation.
That's not real. And sources on the history of autism, with no allegiance to the online neurodiversity movement, can verify this. The second point of incorrectness here is itself an intertwined pair of wrong ideas. One being that former Asperger's disorder, as it was known under the DSM-4, was not a disability, and the second being that the neurodiversity paradigm and the autistic self-advocacy movement hinge on the desire to erase any sense of disability from the semantic space of the word autism, both of which are factually untrue. Though a few autistic people diagnosed in the pre-DSM-5 age became famous as self-advocates, there are countless other autistic people diagnosed prior to 2013 who engaged in self-advocacy without becoming well-known or widely spoken of as people like Temple Grandin. And the fact of autistic characteristics being potentially disabling to autistic people is a key position held by forefront autistic self-advocacy groups like Asan. The fact that Christina was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome in the DSM-4 era and chooses to self-identify with that obsolete term today does nothing to skew my opinion for or against the points I'm mentioning here. She's still factually wrong.
Number 28,
Yeah, now that we're dealing with actual NCSA published statements from NCSA personalities, this is at the bottom of my list because I personally don't care at all about Sia, but in terms of evaluating the quality of Jill Escher's autism discourse,
I have been in the autism world now for much more than 2 decades, and I cannot believe what has happened to this word. It is so utterly meaningless that, this highly successful, articulate person who's completely functional can adopt that term, and not a single member of the media questions it. I mean, the cruelty. I remember Sia saying after the whole Pile-On episode that she became suicidal. And if you're not prepared for this level of utter BS, and you're a sensitive person like Sia, you can become suicidal.
she called Sia completely functional when she wants us to reject the idea that she could be diagnosed with lower support needs autism spectrum disorder, which just happens to be associated with significantly increased risk of suicidal thoughts or actions. But when Jill wants us to despise the viciously partisan neurodiversity hotheads on Twitter, suddenly Jill wants to highlight the fact that Sia was suicidal over their harassment aimed against her. It's something that coincidentally would hopefully spur someone experiencing such symptoms to seek help from a professional clinician who's likely to evaluate them for one or more conditions in the DSM, which could potentially include autism.
Person who's completely functional, that she became suicidal. Person who's completely functional, that she became suicidal.
Jill, I know you want to present yourself as an autism expert, but I somehow don't imagine that an autism or disability expert would describe a known person experiencing suicidal thoughts or actions as also being completely functional.
I'm not even sure what that means, but that's crazy.
Number 27.
Yeah, so entry 27, this spot is dedicated to a page on the NCSA website where Jill reviewed Love on the Spectrum, a reality TV dating show about autistic people that Jill would consider relatively higher functioning and who are able to do things that are reportedly out of reach for Jill's own autistic children. Ironically, the reason that this is on the list is because Jill gave Love on the Spectrum a positive review, which is fine by me. I have no stake in defending the validity or veracity of anything presented on that show because I've never watched it. But she specifically, Jill does, discusses Abby, an autistic TikTok celebrity. Now the bullshit part is when you juxtapose this with Jill's derisive TikTok autism statements.
And this isn't TikTok autism. You have to have a developmental disability to qualify for services in this system.
And other comments she's made elsewhere, calling it absurd that people capable of attempting romantic relationships could be considered autistic when her own kids can't do that.
They might be fully functional, independent adults. They might have college degrees. They might have successful careers. They might be married. They might have children. So the people at that very, very high end of autism who are super privileged, right?
If Jill feels sympathetic towards Abby, she needs to realize that messages that she herself has published and have validated through the NCSA makes people far more likely to challenge Abby's right to even consider herself disabled or autistic and be safe in doing so. It directly draws into question Abby's ability to have received the years of therapy she needed to function in the context of the non-disabled world to the extent that she does today. So Jill, if you're watching this and think it's impossible that your messages could be making life harder for autistic people like Abby, you need to realize that the discriminatory mindsets you promote are so prevalent that Abby's own mother has literally done that to other autistic people who Abby's mother personally thinks are too successful compared to her daughter to be legitimately autistic. She's done this in Abby's own presence to people who have jobs like writers, saying that it's confusing that successful people like writers could be considered autistic, when her own daughter is literally a social media celebrity. Jill, even in the comments of your own articles on non-NCSA platforms, people who support and like you use Love on the Spectrum as an example of media messages that give a false depiction of autism that allegedly trivializes the struggles of autistic people. People like that could be the next ones to send Abby angry messages, accusing her of falsely self-proclaiming autism. And comments targeting Abby are already easily discoverable online, accusing her of faking autism for clout. Great job, Jill.
Number 26.
Jill name drops repeatedly well-known autistic doctorate degree holder, animal behaviorist, writer, and speaker Temple Grandin at every opportunity since Jill's NCSA ally and friend, Tom McKean, toured with her doing seminars and panels in the 1990s.
Temple Grandin,
Yeah.
Temple Grandin, Temple Grandin, Temple Grandin, and certainly Temple Grandin.
Yet, Jill also publishes messages proven to cause young people today with similar challenges and talents as Temple Grandin, as well as people of all support needs levels who are visible or accessible online, to be confronted and challenged and harassed as alleged disability fakers who are appropriating the struggles of so-called true autistic people like Jill's 2 children. Very hypocritical.
Number 25.
A person of high leadership within the NCSA who did a live stream in support of 14C, which, if you don't know, is a labor regulations policy that effectively allows for the creation of sub-minimal wage jobs for high support needs disabled people. Conceptually, as its supporters would explain, as more of an enrichment opportunity than an attempt at gainful employment. Positions provided to employee participants to allow them to be constructively occupied and visible within the community when they otherwise wouldn't be able to compete with a non-disabled person for a similar fully paid position. Regardless of my opinion, the nature of 14C is controversial, and that's a fact that transcends my feelings. The NCSA personality who filmed this presentation says so herself, though I do want to acknowledge that in this specific recorded live stream instance, it also contains a moment where she, in her own non-explicitly stated way, basically reels in her live chat of NCSA supporters and advises them not to blame all their problems on Hassan, even if she doesn't say that explicitly, and you could take that for what you see it as. Anyway, in my opinion on 14C doesn't matter for the purposes of my observation here, and my personal concern over the potential for abuse and exploitation of the label of disabled people is not what caused this NCSA leadership member's livestream to make it onto my list. What puts this on my list is this moment here, where she explains how parents of high support needs autistic people can use their custodian status to make public statements in support of 14C by openly role-playing as their children, writing sympathy-farming messages the autistic people concerned reportedly couldn't have possibly written themselves.
We have already drafted a standardized letter here, but we also have a space down here, and it can get pretty long, where we are encouraging you to personalize this message in your own words, to share your story and any additional goals and recommendations that you have, to really humanize this issue from the personal perspective. You might say, just told me not to put any identifying information in there. Your name is okay, right? And I'll tell you what I did personally. I did this as I submitted a public comment, and I also went back and submitted one in my daughter's name with her email address I used for her materials, and there was no hiding anything there. I stated, I am a 21-year-old with profound autism, and my mother/caregiver/conservator is writing this on my behalf because I cannot read, write, nor self-advocate effectively, right? And I go into the impacts of my state eliminating 14C from her perspective and how that really has limited her options in the state. So if you are the conservator of an adult, I also recommend that you consider that as well. And that's it. It really takes 2 seconds. And I am so glad to see the very first day that we launched this.
I don't consider myself well informed enough on the details of 14C to critically comment on it in detail here, and I don't find it to be my business to comment on any individual autistic person and their family's arrangements in regards to custodianship. But what I do find to be obvious bullshit is, thanks to this live stream, the NCSA as a whole has created a situation where their president, their board members, hold autistic people who are able to publish independent messages in public contempt and ridicule, and denounce them as being out of line for speaking against discrimination and stigma that impacts their careers.
Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But they use doctors with autism. And
meanwhile, other members of NCSA leadership take pride in making their fantasy role-playing sessions part of the public record, as they literally pretend to be their own children to compose and publish messages of support for controversial labor laws that the autistic people these NCSA members and supporters are pretending to be, by the NCSA's own description, could not have possibly authored for themselves.
I am a 21-year-old with profound autism, and my mother/caregiver/conservator is writing this on my behalf because I cannot read, write, nor self-advocate effectively, right? And I go into the impacts of my state, eliminating 14C.
It paints an overall landscape where the only autistic people the NCSA approves of communicating with the non-autistic world are people for whom the NCSA and their supporters happen to have total control over. Given the NCSA's outspoken concern for the authenticity of authorship of high support needs autistic people in regards to certain forms of facilitated communication whose veracity is contested, this practice certainly makes the topic fertile ground for further discussion and criticism.
Number 24. Oh, Hilfamira.
Just like we cannot generalize about the more complex side of the spectrum, we cannot generalize about the high functioning side of the spectrum either.
Oh, never mind. That's good. That's probably the most unobjectionable thing in this entire podcast. I mean, she's right. We shouldn't generalize the needs of disabled people.
Just like we cannot generalize about the more complex side of the spectrum, we cannot generalize about the high functioning side of the spectrum either. So both of those are so drastically different. There's no way that they can even meet in the middle of or needs or definition. So
God damn it, no! You're learning the wrong lesson from this!
Both of those are so drastically different. There's no way that they can even meet in the middle of or needs or definition. So I agree with Dr. Wachtel that there needs to be two separate diagnoses, two separate categories.
Dr. Arvizu, your stance on generalization of disability took a complete 180-degree turn mid-sentence. You literally said that we shouldn't be generalizing disability characteristics and support needs, and then used that statement to generalize disability characteristics and support needs. I mean, what the fuck?
Number 23.
Hey everybody, let's listen to NCSA board member Dr. Lee Wachtel criticize the existence of high-functioning autism, as she calls it, by drawing a comparison to myopia.
Maybe the solution lies along the lines of separate diagnostic categories so that different diagnoses can be given to people who present very differently, as they should be. Just like, you don't just say like, oh, well, you have like hypertension. Well, it matters if you have like mild, moderate, or severe hypertension. I mean, you have myopia. Well, okay, there's not like one size fits all like lens. It matters like what your value is. And that's critical in everything in medicine. And I think there does need to be, people do need to have a little bit more guts in terms of speaking up and standing like for the truth. But it's hard. It is definitely hard because nobody is really protected, and we do live in a society where ultimately like identity cannot be touched and people are able to claim whatever identity they want.
Lee, you just criticized autism spectrum disorder under the DSM-5. on the basis that it's ineffective and not specific enough of a definition. In the DSM-5, ASD has a 3-tiered support needs level system of Level 1, Level 2, and Level 3, often described as being ranked least severe to most severe, though not everyone agrees with that conceptualization of it. The system is in place. And then you used myopia as a positive example of a sensible diagnostic system, in which you described with a 3-tiered ranking system of mild, moderate, and severe. Lee, I didn't cut that to make you look silly. I'm just confused as to why you consider a 3-tiered severity system unacceptable for autism, which you don't have. But directly contrast that. You consider a 3-tiered severity system ranking a positive example for support needs differentiation for myopia, when you, Lee, happen to be a myopia patient. Now, if anyone watching this somehow thinks that I altered the footage to make Lee seem absurdly hypocritical, I don't blame you, because I had to watch this entire podcast tens of dozens of times, and this specific moment tens of dozens of times, before I began to accept that this was real and they actually said these things.
Number 22.
Yeah, for this entry, Dr. Lopez Arvizu, she just keeps bitching and moaning about how those she calls high-functioning autistic people are canceling who she calls lower-functioning autistic people. I personally think that she just considers the fact that autistics like me exist at all to be an act of hostility against her autistic patients, which is totally not what prejudiced people do. And that was sarcasm, by the way, just so you know.
And I think, canceling the people that speak for that lower end of the spectrum, you are canceling these individuals that cannot really speak for themselves, but not giving or allowing the opinion of the ones that care for them. You are doing exactly what you think they're doing to you. So, that is the problem. That is the bias. That is the narrow view of this concept.
You NCSA panelists are fertilizing a landscape of disability discourse in which the mere existence of relatively higher functioning autistic people, as you call us, constitutes a form of cancellation against those you call truly autistic. And I could say that with confidence because people already believe that now and act on that by targeting us for abuse, even if they never heard of your shit tier organization. And those who have heard of you, I've seen comments from random members of the public from them on your modestly patronized YouTube comment sections, in which for some reason people watch your videos and then feel inspired to make negative remarks about relatively higher functioning autistic people, and have decided after watching NCSA videos that these strangers need to be brought to task for bearing disability labels the NCSA has not given them permission to use, in spite of the fact that your civilian nonprofit is not an accredited medical or psychiatric agency and has no authority over anyone's diagnostic status.
Number 21. Big time for sure.
Many of the people that really assume the diagnosis of autism and went public and went on a soapbox, they did so by wearing color glasses. Okay, they would put in color glasses and all of a sudden they were sensitive to light and they were autistic. Okay, they get out of their color glasses and they are no longer autistic. It's the Superman identity.
Right.
There was a very famous autistic so-called
Dr. Casanova, a guest of Jill Escher on the official NCSA podcast, decided to use this opportunity to take actual disability aids and diagnostic labels as evidence that someone is dishonestly representing themselves as autistic, in addition to the claim that you can look at someone without performing an examination and tell whether or not they're autistic.
And she wrote several books about autism, and she gave a lot of lectures around the world. And if you actually saw her, she wasn't really autistic at all. She had some skills, and it was sort of funny. She would write poetry, she would paint.
As though there's a clinically recognized visual profile of what an autistic person is supposed to look like. And there isn't. I mean, needless to say, that's entirely bullshit. And it's bullshit that specifically made my life difficult when employers refused to hire me for years due to the doctor-prescribed custom-made sensory glasses I needed to wear for a large part of my life to ward off stroke-like headaches. And the prescription of those glasses required a visit to a specialist who was hundreds of miles away from where I lived at that time. Think I'm doing this out of the sake of ease and convenience? Nope. There was no TikTok back in the fucking 90s when I was dealing with this shit to begin with. And I know some of you may think, oh, we don't mean people like you. I mean the people that are really faking it. Well, guess what? That doesn't fucking matter, because you saying shit like this causes people who you may not have the opportunity to individually advise on that shit to see me and people like me as faking it anyway. So knock off the shit and realize that your words and actions have consequences on innocent people's lives, you fuckers. I got angry and went off script. Can you tell?
Number 20.
Not only serves as an example of Lee Wachtel implicating the people in the Spectrum News article about autistic doctors of holding principled stances and opinions they never discussed or stated in the article, but it also demonstrates a rather explicit example of Lee treating high-functioning autism as an agenda-driven political movement with membership on an elective and voluntary basis rather than an actual range of neurodevelopmental disability, whether or not any individual wants to frame that range of disability in the context of high versus low functioning.
Well, the people with high-functioning autism, like those individuals in many of those articles, don't want autism to be in the DSM. That's like one of the goals of some of these advocates, is that should be removed.
To speculate that Lee framed her statements as doctors like the ones in those articles, because she knows that the doctors in the only article they discussed and repeatedly referred back to throughout that recording session never said anything like that, is to imagine that Lee is a lot more clever than she could possibly actually be.
Well, the people with high-functioning autism, like those individuals in many of those articles, don't want autism to be in the DSM. That's like one of the goals of some of these advocates, is that should be removed.
Yeah, so let's do a little thought experiment. What if right now, after I complain for hours specifically about the NCSA Autism Confidential podcast series, I made a comment that panelists like the ones in these podcasts like to smoke big, cheap, smelly cigars for breakfast, when no one in any of these podcasts ever talked about smoking big, cheap, smelly cigars for breakfast. If I said some shit like that and made a very specific claim discussing the idea that unspecified people like Jill and her podcast panelists at the NCSA like to smoke big, cheap, smelly cigars for breakfast, without actually saying that they specifically smoke big, cheap, smelly cigars for breakfast. The coincidence that it might fit my personal worldview to believe that NCSA panelists or unspecified people similar to them smoke big, cheap, smelly cigars for breakfast wouldn't make that true, and it wouldn't make me less incorrect for stating that in that transparently deceptive context. Now, of course, everyone knows that Jill and her NCSA panelist friends don't smoke big, cheap, smelly cigars for breakfast. It's actually Indian Valley Railroad station master Stacy Jones who smokes big, fat, smelly cigars for breakfast. I have it on good authority.
JBK and even Midge Smoot want to be Santa's helper.
Right, but you can't vote for any of them, no. Because they all smoke big, cheap, smelly cigars.
Big, cheap, smelly cigars.
Right, for breakfast.
For breakfast?
Yes, stinko ones.
I find that difficult to believe.
Well, that's because you're not concentrating hard enough. You need to try a little harder. Perhaps these nickels will help you concentrate. And remember to vote for Schemer for Santa's helper.
And by the way, about that whole DSM thing in regards to that Lee quote, just to be clear, that idea is not discussed or even hinted at by the people featured in the article that their podcast is complaining about. The people in the article in question never said those things at all.
What you're saying isn't real.
So Lee is once again making shit up and holding people accountable for the fake shit she made up. Because in this moment, she doesn't care about real life, and thinks that her words dictate actual reality. Now, to be clear, there are people, including neurodiversity proponents and autistic self-advocates, who write about an eventual post-DSM landscape of our conceptualization of human neurology, disorder, disability, mental illness, and human brain variations. And those arguments can take a number of forms. The most widespread one that I've encountered, and the one that seems to be given the most credibility, is simply a recognition that the original DSM was published closing in on a century ago, and no matter how radically it's been restructured and reconceptualized over multiple generations, our understanding of how the human brain works, thanks to advancing science, has outpaced the ability for a single book to suitably cover all of it.
Number 19.
I see people in associations that are layman support organizations for autism. And all of a sudden, in order to be fair, they put autistic individuals into their boards. Usually those are the more prominent autistic individuals that they can find and use them as a banner for their organization. And you examine their credentials and you will find that in one case, the individual at most may have had PDD, NOS, autism, but when he was examined, maybe at 4 years of age, he was completely normal. Okay, so he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board.
Right.
And
I won't mention names, but several very prominent advocates come to mind who, in my view, just simply do not meet diagnostic criteria for autism. Certainly, I think they have issues.
In case you don't know your way around the lingo being used, Dr. C just accused someone of wrongfully claiming autism to serve on an autism advisory board when they never had an official diagnosis. Dr. C's proof of them having never received an official diagnosis of autism was the fact that they were diagnosed with PPD-NOS, which was an actual clinically recognized DSM-4 era diagnosis in the autism spectrum range of what are now called developmental disabilities. In the DSM-4 era, The PPD-NOS diagnosis included what was then known as atypical autism, and the DSM-5 explicitly states that PPD-NOS diagnoses are to be reassigned with autism spectrum disorder. In other words, Dr. C's accusation that this person was wrongfully claiming to be diagnosed with autism was the fact that the person in question was literally diagnosed with autism.
The individual at most may have had PPD-NOS autism.
Dr. C, you literally called it autism yourself. What kind of shit is this?
Number 18, teen there, and its souvenir medallion.
So for number 18, Lee wanted to demonstrate how autistic self-advocates were high-functioning, frivolous complainers, thriving in luxury, while being indifferent to the suffering of those Lee described as having true autism. So she puts this slide in her presentation.
And these are some things that I sometimes call like advocacy luxuries. Eye contact is overrated. Did you happen to know that autistic adults don't like the use of the puzzle piece? Well, that really doesn't interest me at all. Frankly, when you work in a facility where the daily tasks involve caring for people recovering from retinal reattachment surgery, updating different regimens and protocols for protective equipment, and dealing with medical disaster after medical disaster, my interest really doesn't lie in whether people like the puzzle piece or not, because I have such bigger fish to fry in my own clinical setting, and I know that the families that we're serving and the hundreds of families who are on the wait list and hoping to be served by Kennedy Krieger or by other facilities who work with individuals with profound autism also have much bigger fish to fry, and these types of things would be truly luxuries in their lives to be able to consider.
Lee, you literally go out of your way to complain how autistic self-advocates who align with the neurodiversity paradigm reject the puzzle piece imagery for autism and prefer the community-made infinity loop iconography. But one of the images demonstrating these so-called self-advocacy luxuries is inexplicably a shirt with the message, "Autism isn't a disability, it's a different ability," a sentiment and slogan which is overwhelmingly despised by autistic self-advocates and neurodiversity proponents. And on top of that, it uses puzzle piece images which you yourself should know that these people don't like, because you literally seconds earlier just complained about that fact as a main point of contention. So Lee, once again, this is a shirt design aimed at the parents of autistic children, and you're using it to question the credibility and sincerity of autistic self-advocates you frame as the ideological opponents of the parents of so-called truly autistic people.
And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
Lee Wachtel is the kind of person who would play Pac-Man by deliberately getting herself eaten by the ghosts and avoiding as many of the dots, power pellets, and bonus fruits as possible, and at the end of it complained that the game was cheating when the game over message showed up on screen.
Souvenir medallion. Number 17.
In number 17, Lee goes on this rant about how funny it would be if high-functioning autistic self-advocates went to her neurobehavioral unit and consulted her so-described low-functioning autistic patients on how to find apartments and get jobs and run for elective office, and it's just... wow.
You know, it has to, you can't say that those people are discounted or that their diagnosis isn't real, or come up with all sorts of other nonsense statements like, well, actually those people are just as high functioning as I am, it's a societal issue, or you don't know how to understand them, and if you listen to me. I mean, those individuals, I really, when I hear that type of garbage, I feel like, inviting them, okay, well, you know what, we're always short of direct care staff on a neurobehavioral unit. So if you'd like to come and work with some of my patients and talk to them about running for office or what type of job that they'd like to have and how they're going to purchase an apartment, Have at it.
Yeah.
Lee, it is so strange to see you go on this rant. It's so bizarre, and it's simultaneous disrespect to autistic people of all support needs levels and descriptions that I don't even know how to comment on it without accidentally validating or dignifying any element of it. Now, if you feel that certain relatively higher functioning autistic self-advocates, as you call us, have taken up some idealistic rejection of the idea that other autistic people may have profiles of deficits or impairments that put many fundamental life skills beyond their reach, I'll break ranks with certain other autistic self-advocates by saying that I believe that you are allowed to talk about that. But none of the high-functioning autistic people in the article that is the axis of your discussion have ever said that shit, which makes you full of shit. And you repeatedly refer back to that article along with your co-panelist.
They ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma.
That are described in that article.
That's something that we don't talk about enough in this kind of articles like the Spectrum publishes. It is the bias. You are absolutely writing all these documents with the bias that,
Well, the people with high functioning autism, like those individuals in many of those articles, don't want autism to be in the DSM.
So you can't even try to claim that you're not talking about the article at that point. You refer back to it every chance you get. This article is your Exhibit A, and holding what you call high-functioning autism to trial. And really, the tone of your attitude. Now, I sincerely don't like saying this, but I couldn't find any other way to really describe how uncomfortable I feel, and the fact that I'm uncomfortable saying that reflects how uncomfortable I guess it is, or how messed up what you're saying is. But this argument of yours reminds me of arguments made by certain critics of animal rights extremism. And I think it's fair to argue that that says more about me than it does about Lee Wachtel. But all the same, I think it's worth examining why Lee's statements about who she calls lower functioning autistic people in regards to possibly attaining even cursory levels of so-called normal functionality later in life would remind anyone of arguments made to discredit animal rights extremism. That's all I'm going to say about that for now.
Number 16.
So in 16, Dr. Arvizu is way too fixated on these accusations that this Spectrum News article about autistic doctors is biased against autistic people she calls lower functioning, because it happens to be about people that Dr. Arvizu considers higher functioning. There's no natural element of conflict here, but Dr. Arvizu is going to turn it into one.
I think we are seeing more and more of the ability of some individuals to speak very strongly about their feelings about the diagnosis and the past definitions and past implications, and kind of almost canceling anyone that has a different opinion now that we are in the new modality of canceling people that we disagree with. There's so many of the people we serve that will never be able to even understand what a word doctor is. So that is what the conversation should be about. If we're going to define this, or if it's defined as a spectrum, then allow the needle of the spectrum to move, and allow the both extremes and the ones that are in the middle to be able to have a voice as well. Do not dominate the conversation because that is what bias is. And that's something that we don't talk about enough in this kind of articles like the Spectrum publishes. It is the bias. You are absolutely writing all these documents with the bias. We need to start talking about bias. So that is the problem. That is the bias. That is the narrow view of this concept.
Dr. Arvizu, you cannot possibly get more biased and extreme than complaining that the mere ability for perspectives other than your own to be published therefore constitutes censorship and cancellation against your beliefs, especially when the article you're complaining about specifically did nothing to discredit or marginalize the so described lower functioning autistic people you're pretending to be defending with this podcast appearance.
Number 15.
Yeah, so number 15 is not what you probably think it is. Let's roll a clip.
Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, they use doctors with autism. And
Jill, you're so obviously spiteful and full of shit for laughing at even clinically diagnosed autistic people fighting workplace discrimination. It's to the point where the fact that you said that isn't even what got this moment a spot on the list. What got this moment a spot on the list was that just a few minutes earlier, in this same podcast episode, you said that Sia's movie Music was miraculous and wonderful for featuring a nonverbal autistic character who reminded you of your own daughter.
it was a miraculous, wonderful thing that somebody like my daughter was depicted on the big screen. There was no damage done.
But minutes earlier, an equally fictional autistic side character on Grey's Anatomy is used as proof that the concept of an autistic doctor is so obviously absurd that the Grey's Anatomy character proves that such people couldn't possibly exist in real life.
So I'm curious, you guys, you've had long careers in medicine. How many doctors have you met who you would diagnose with autism?
None.
The one in, what was that, Grey's Anatomy? There was one.
Oh, the one on TV.
Yeah.
The TV doctor, right, who doesn't exist in real life.
And as an aside that doubles the length of this entry, there's a sappy movie called The Unbreakable Boy that's being promoted lately, about, at least at the time that I'm recording this, and it's about an autistic middle school student. Now, a lot of people in the neurodiversity community are already dismissing this as yet another example of an autistic character being used not as a proper character in and of themselves, but as a anthropomorphic prop to drive the character growth of the non-autistic characters around them. And I noticed a number of comments from autism attack parents accusing this movie, The Unbreakable Boy, of being neurodiversity propaganda painting a false picture of autism, and further remarks from the same people moaning that the world needs realistic depictions of autism, like Sia's movie Music, which was also hated by neurodiversity proponents. Given that both Music and The Unbreakable Boy were panned by autistic self-advocates, I had no fucking clue why these autism attack parents would embrace Sia's movie as a realistic depiction of autism while attacking The Unbreakable Boy as neurodiversity propaganda, until I realized the autistic main character in Music is nonverbal, and the autistic character in The Unbreakable Boy uses spoken language. Yeah, so that's the defining line between real autism and fake autism to these people. There are so many autistic people including some individuals that NCSA President Jill Escher have made very positive public comments about, who can only use spoken language at the level they do today and integrate significantly with the non-disabled world at the level they do today, because they underwent years of speech therapy and other services that were made available to them because they had been diagnosed with autism. I thought services to improve the lives of autistic people were what these NCSA folks were fighting for in the first place.
Number 14.
It's become almost, it's sadly almost like faddish to for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic. And I think that in sharp contrast to many patients with autism, particularly the ones that Dr. Lopez and I work with, autism had taken on kind of this character of like almost like a fantasy, a gift, like it's special to be this way. And, you bring something like special and unique to the world that other people don't have. And it's become kind of cool and interesting to be neurodivergent. And it seems that a lot of people, rather than perhaps looking more deeply at the crux of the issues that they're experiencing, have happily taken on this moniker of autism as something that explains the challenges that they feel that they have, and that they can also pawn off as a very positive thing, because now the current trend is all autism should be embraced and experienced and celebrated as a gift. And so you can turn what your struggles were into something that you can claim that people should celebrate. And I think it gives people kind of a lot of an out in a way to take on this term and erase any type of negativity or association of a challenge with what they're experiencing. But unfortunately, it just really bears no semblance to what autism was when it was initially described by Kanner, when it was studied in the 70s by Rutter, and all the research that we have on autism is not what currently people are terming autism. And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
I have to agree. So, that's exactly the issue, the classic definition of autism.
Aside from the fact that true autism is not a scientifically or professionally recognized term, and that you need to fuck yourself for even saying that as a person in a position of leadership within a hospital that specializes in working with disabled children, you said all of that shit inexplicably in response to an article in which none of the people implicitly falsely autistic who were featured within it said any of the things that you were complaining about. How the fuck do you take an article about clinically diagnosed autistic people saying that they felt internally or permanently broken upon receiving autism diagnoses after they submitted themselves to help to improve their day-to-day functionality? An article about them forming support groups to attempt to push forward on their career paths in spite of clinically documented, clinical, and highly stigmatized disabilities, only for you to come out of nowhere and accuse them of having self-adopted autism to seem cool and interesting and to erase any sense of challenge or difficulty from their experiences as disabled people. And it's really fucking strange and concerning that someone with a position of leadership in a hospital for disabled children would go around saying things about disabled adults and present that as the truth about autism, a supposed truth that you claim to be uniquely courageous for defending.
Amongst a lot of professionals, I think that Carmen and I are probably a lot more willing than others to speak out and speak the truth. But many people are not, because they don't want to be canceled, and they don't want to get in trouble. And that just perpetuates, this situation ongoing. I think there does need to be people do need to have a little bit more guts in terms of speaking up and standing like for the truth. But it's hard. It is definitely hard because nobody is really protected, and we do live in a society where ultimately like identity cannot be touched and people are able to claim whatever identity they want.
The only truth here, Lee, is that you suck at pretending not to view autistic people other than your own patients as ideological adversaries to be defeated. And that's fucking stupid.
Number 13.
So there's most of you people out there in the listener land have heard of Spectrum News. They ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, they use doctors with autism. So this is what Spectrum News considers to be autism. And we just heard it.
Even if you disagree with the DSM-5, why pin this personally against Spectrum News to make it seem like they're conducting fraudulent autism diagnoses without clinical authority? Jill, Spectrum News did not diagnose Dr. Javed with autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. A licensed professional using professional-grade diagnostic methods and manuals diagnosed Dr. Javed with those things after they performed at least one personal evaluation on her, if not a series of them. And the writer of the article is discussing the experience Dr. Javed shared with them. If Spectrum News was on the street giving random people superficial personality tests or questionnaires, told the participants that they were autistic based on that alone, and then wrote an article about those people, we'd be having a very different discussion, one where I might even agree with you. But that's not what fucking happened. Do you think Spectrum News just made up this shit out of nowhere? These characteristics are what the DSM considers on the spectrum of autism and adjacent disabilities, not just today, but as far back as 30 years ago. A patient as far back as 30 years ago, a patient as far back as at least 1994, who experienced these things and others, and had a professional licensed doctor or other practitioner evaluate these things as being severe and clinically significant impairments in important areas of the patient's functioning. That patient could receive diagnoses allowing them to receive therapies, medication, counseling, and other accommodations and services. Yet you people at the NCSA call those diagnosed within that range of disability to be super privileged, and of their modern diagnostic nomenclature being a violent absurdity against your children, who you implied, unlike them, are actually suffering. To get back to the Spectrum News article, it's like your discrediting of Dr. Javed's diagnosis is a mere coincidence of the real goal, which is inexplicably to take swings at Spectrum News in spite of them being so unimportant that supposedly no one even reads it anymore, at least according to you. Seriously, what did Spectrum News do to you, Jill? Did they send pizza to your house that you didn't order? Did they train rats to nest in your walls and shit in your cereal? That seems bizarrely personal to you, Jill, and it's like part of an ongoing feud or something, and it makes zero sense. It makes no sense, to the point that my weaponized autistic research instincts tingle at the very thought of it, and it may warrant further investigation.
Number 12.
Jill, why are you so prolific? All right, let's just get this over with.
So this is what Spectrum News considers to be autism. This is, and we just heard it, sensory overload, communication, and difficulty expressing emotions. Okay, that describes a lot of people I know who don't have autism.
Like so? I mean, really, Jill, like so what? Like who fucking cares? It's really astounding to watch you attempt to retract or at least encourage doubt toward the personalized clinical evaluation that a licensed healthcare worker performed on someone you never met, on the basis that you, Jill, who is not even a fucking doctor, knows people who aren't autistic. You knowing people that aren't autistic does not give you the necessary credentials or validity to determine that someone you never met isn't autistic, especially not validity that somehow surpasses someone who actually met and performed a professional evaluation on this person. And Dr. Javed has been through more than enough, and I sincerely hope that Dr. Jaleel Javed never has to learn about your fucked up podcast holding her up as an object of ridicule. And I also hope that Dr. Jaleel Javed never learns about my video series, even if this gains significant traction. And I will say that not only if anyone targets or harasses Jill and her dumbass NCSA friends and allies, you are not an ally or a partner or friendly to me. And anyone who somehow alerts Dr. Jaleel Javed of the NCSA's lambasting of her in public, or alerts Dr. Jaleel Javed of my video series is also not a friend to me. Don't do it.
Number 11.
So I have experienced the whole spectrum, and they're very different. There's no way that you can compare, and you cannot generalize. You cannot generalize labels. You cannot generalize clinical presentation, and you cannot generalize their needs. There's no way.
Dr. Arvizu, you fucked it up again, and I really can't believe the fact that you said that somehow not to insist that the support needs of disabled individuals shouldn't be facetiously compared to each other to dismiss or minimalize the challenges of one disabled person compared to another. But inexplicably, you said that to definitively slam the door on the idea that people you call higher functioning and lower functioning autistic people even have anything in common, in spite of the fact that I have personally received services and education alongside people with autism and other disabilities, including people who needed radically more support than me. And the mildest special education and disability support services they received were the most intense and most invasive of those services and supports that I received, and that I required to even function in a public school setting. Meanwhile, your dumbass said that it's wrong for people like me to call ourselves autistic in line with our actual official diagnostic descriptions, based on your biased and baseless assumption that people like me can't possibly even require access to disability support services and special education.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
Dr. Arvizu, if you somehow did not mean to say that, as though to imply that people in my relatively mild or non-severe or low support needs range of neurodevelopmental disability don't need access to special education and disability support services, it's your responsibility as a doctor and as a guest on the podcast of an autism advocacy organization which you are an ally of and the colleague of a board member of, to understand that people and the general public already believe that any disabled person whose support needs profile does not demand a setting of 24-hour at-home care or indefinite hospitalization, therefore must have zero requirements in terms of disability services, because there's already a widespread problem where people with extensive clinically documented impairments are being barred from disability support services they require to even attempt to integrate into mainstream educational or workplace settings because their mere ability to read or write or walk or use spoken language or look at someone's face for more than a second, any one or more of those things possibly being things that they fought for years for. And once again, I mention, are all valid descriptions of disability somehow disqualify those people from possibly being disabled or autistic? And I once again need to mention that the way you decided to respond to an article about clinically diagnosed autistic people, erasing any possible argument for or against the alleged invalidity of self-diagnosis, was by you making disapproving statements about people self-labeling and self-identifying themselves with autism. So regardless of anyone's stance on the validity of self-diagnosis of autism, how can you even pretend to say that you're criticizing self-diagnosis when you're saying that explicitly in direct response to an article about clinically diagnosed autistic people? It really does directly invalidate your trustworthiness and being taken seriously on anything you have to say about any disabled person of any description or present diagnostic status in terms of the professional or formal arena. And it really does seem like throughout this podcast episode, you and your friends want to create the impression in your audience's mind that a clinical diagnosis of autism whose characteristics describe a relatively high capability for independent functionality with relatively minimal external support requirement, keyword being requirement, is therefore tantamount to a bad faith amateur self-diagnosis devoid of a professional involvement and credibility as a legitimate disability. And I've already seen that expressed by other autism attack parents and autism attack doctors outside of the NCSA. And I'm sure a lot of people, even those who strongly disagree with each other about the credibility of autistic self-diagnosis, would strongly disapprove of the notion of diagnosis that they call high-functioning autism being tantamount to a facetious self-diagnosis. Yet that's how extreme of a position the NCSA has painted itself into, and you can't get away without leaving some really nasty footprints that lead to some pretty hurt people.
Number 10.
As some kind of amazing coincidence, it turns out that Dr. Arvizu seems to think that who she calls high and low functioning autistic people are at war with each other. Who would have thought?
I agree with Dr. Wachtel that there needs to be two separate diagnoses, two separate categories. And then you brought up about the DSM. So which one should stay in the DSM? Should profound autism or the population that we define as profound autism in our practice should even be in the DSM? Maybe the high functioning can stay there and the other one can be a disorder and be as a medical condition. I don't know.
These people need to realize that high and low functioning autism, as they call them, aren't in a fucking civil war where only one can be recognized by the American Psychiatric Association to get listed in the DSM and be treated as legitimate by the professional healthcare world. This is unbelievably outlandish and wild bullshit that speaks volumes to the NCSA's perspective on different subcategories or subdescriptions of the autism spectrum, and it's fucking scary. And you know what this sounds like to me? It reminds me of in the 20th century, when, for example, competing socialist factions within the same country would clash with each other to be recognized as legitimate by the Communist International and get support from the Soviet Union. And here I was thinking the enemy disability advocates were supposed to be fighting was suffering, but the NCSA seems to think that it's other disabled people. What the fuck are people donating to when they support the NCSA with tax-free donations? They deserve an answer for that.
Number 9.
You can't say that those people are discounted or that their diagnosis isn't real, or come up with all sorts of other nonsense statements like, well, actually those people are just as high functioning as I am. It's a societal issue, or you don't know how to understand them. And if you listen to me, I mean, those individuals, I really, when I hear that type of garbage, I feel like, inviting them, okay, well, you know what, we're always short of direct care staff on a neurobehavioral unit. So if you'd like to come and work with some of my patients and talk to them about running for office or what type of job that they'd like to have and how they're going to purchase an apartment, have at it.
Yeah, I totally see your point. I mean, I won't mention names, but there are those quote unquote autistic doctors. Of course, I don't see a speck of autism in these people, but whatever, who have been antagonistic towards those who speak out on behalf of the severely affected.
Jill, I've said this a dozen times, but you aren't a fucking doctor. And I'm so bored of saying that, that's not even what got this statement on the list. What got this statement on the list was how sneaky and weird does someone have to be to do a podcast recording revolving around an article that pissed you off because it discussed high-functioning autistic people, as you call them, serving as doctors, that you strategically only chose to read the first 9% of, which only discussed one autistic doctor within that 9%, Dr. Tahil Javed, and then coincidentally, you just happened to mention completely unrelated autistic doctors who you claim not only hate the parents and doctors of so-called true autistic children, as your board member Lee Wachtel puts it, but who also find the existence of who you call lower functioning autistic people to be awful.
It's inherently awful. Their existence is inherently awful to these people. Anyway, I won't elaborate on that too much. But
Jill, the doctors you're talking about in that moment have nothing to do with anything featured in that Spectrum News article you read from, and has nothing to do with anything said in the Spectrum News article you read from. Not in the first 9% that you actually read out loud. It has nothing to do with the full 100% of it either. But you chose not to explain that explicitly, and it's reasonable that your podcast listeners are going to associate those sentiments with the people in the article, specifically Dr. Tahil Javed, the only autistic doctor that was in the segment that you read, someone that you discussed by fucking laughing at her and then inexplicably saying that you respected her struggles because you're somehow just barely self-aware enough to understand that saying that sounds like the thing to do if you aren't a disability bigot.
yeah, Dr. Javed probably has something going on and probably has challenges. I do not deny her problems, right?
And no, Jill, you need to understand that no one in the modern history of autism advocacy has been treated as viciously and as unfairly as Dr. Tahil Javed has been treated by you and your National Council on Severe Autism. And I'm going to say that later on when I actually discuss how grotesquely you, Jill, and the NCSA have desecrated and disrespected the struggles of Dr. Tahil Javed and her colleagues in a manner in which the National Council on Severe Autism shall never be forgiven for. And if any of my audience members think that sounds like an unhinged, hyperbolic thing for me to say, it means that you, A, never read the Spectrum News article, B, never watched my entire video series when it becomes available in its full length, or C, don't have a soul inside your body.
Nanpa lukatu yaon.
Maybe the high functioning can stay there and the other one can be a disorder and be as a medical condition. I don't know.
Well, the people with high functioning autism, like those individuals in many of those articles, don't want autism to be in the DSM. That's like one of the goals of some of these advocates, is that she be removed from the DSM in the same way that homosexuality was removed from the DSM like a half century ago. So if they don't want it to be seen as a disorder.
Why bring that up now? What point are you trying to make here? Even as someone with zero interest in making you look good in any way, I still personally really wish you did not say that, Lee. Why the fuck are you attracting this much negative attention to yourself? The fact that you chose to display a neurodiversity loop with the phrase neuroqueer as an example of what you called self-advocacy luxuries enjoyed by falsely autistic neurodiversity proponents only makes this look worse for you, because that single slide was already so full of fundamentally false complaints that you debunked some of them yourself as you explained the actual slide. You really suck at this, Lee.
Number 7.
Well, the people with high functioning autism, like those individuals in many of those articles, don't want autism to be in the DSM. That's like one of the goals of some of these advocates, is that she be removed from the DSM in the same way that homosexuality was removed from the DSM like a half century ago. So if they don't want it to be seen as a disorder, well, great, pick another term for it and go on your merry way.
We're going to ignore the mistake in which Lee assumes that autistic self-advocates or neurodiversity proponents hold an official position that they want autism to no longer be considered a disability. Because that's not true, even if some individuals may say that and get pushback from other autistic self-advocates when they do say that. But here's what's really interesting to me, Lee, in this moment. What does it say about Lee? That she's okay with agreeing with people that she says are senselessly hostile and irrational, who supposedly are espousing positions about autism that she wants to frame as silly and devoid of logic, as long as the crazy ideas of her ideological adversaries coincide with her own personal agenda of removing what she describes as high-functioning autism as being a valid subject within scientific disability discourse and professional diagnosis of autism. It really paints a very ironic picture of the NCSA's leadership as people who are willing to discard principled positions and capitulate to supposedly dangerous people, as long as doing so gets them at least part of what they want, which in this case appears to be the exile of what they call non-severe autism from the clinically recognized autism spectrum disorder diagnostic range.
Number 6.
Well, the people with high functioning autism, like those individuals in many of those articles, don't want autism to be in the DSM. That's like one of the goals of some of these advocates, is that she be removed from the DSM in the same way that homosexuality was removed from the DSM like a half century ago. So if they don't want it to be seen as a disorder, well, great, pick another term for it and go on your merry way.
Fuck you.
Pick another term for it and go on your merry way.
Fuck you.
Pick another term for it and go on your merry way.
Fuck you.
Number 5.
Right, they don't want it in the DSM, but they just, I think at some point some form of reason has to prevail. I think that we're stuck in the United States with skewing reality for a lot of fantasy on many levels, and at some point that needs to stop.
Lee, it shouldn't take a fucking cartoon dog with rabbit ears to explain to you that as someone who just spent the better part of an hour using an article about autistic people facing employment discrimination as an excuse to make elaborate complaints about these people, for saying terrible things they never actually said, and doing terrible things they never actually did, and making irrational demands and illogical claims they never actually made, that it turns out your credibility in accusing others of being detached from reality and over-engaged in fantasy is non-existent. Lee, you are amazingly bad at this. And why the fuck should any autistic person trust you and your silly club to influence laws that will impact our lives? Fuck you.
Number 4, there.
We're stuck in the United States with like skewing reality for a lot of fantasy on many levels, and at some point that like needs to stop. Particularly when it comes to, it's just the whole thing of like fighting for equality, equity, and like equal rights for everybody. It's like I always say, you cannot fight for like, racial equity and like spout anti-Semitism at the same time. That's incongruous, and if you act like that, you're just a hypocrite. And I think it's the same thing when you're looking for advocating for rights for people with disability. If you want to advocate for yourself as somebody with high-functioning autism, at the end of the day, you're just a hypocrite. And just as bad as anybody else who has discriminated against people with disability, if you're writing out of the equation those who are the most severely afflicted.
The only people writing anyone out of the disability equation in this piece is you and your organization. I really don't know how the fuck that anyone could be as severely absent in their self-awareness as the 3 panelists of this podcast. It's not the responsibility of relatively higher functioning people within the neurodevelopmental disability sphere, as you so describe us, to remain silent about our support needs and our challenges and our experiences so that you and your patients could take the spotlight. A spotlight is quite ironically the absolute opposite of a spectrum. It is only one wavelength of a spectrum, and it does not belong specifically to you. And us talking about our experiences and support needs requirements isn't a challenge to anyone else's deservingness to be provided with suitable supports, even if those supports are immensely more resource intensive than our own, and many of us have seen the need for those supports with our own eyes, because we grew up receiving disability services alongside many of the people of a description you'd find far more quote-unquote truly autistic than us.
And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
Hey kid, you're a stupid little fucker.
I know these 3 keep treating us like this on the basis that their claim that the people like me, or like those in the Spectrum News article, simply don't have neurodevelopmental disabilities in the first place, but they don't get to decide that based on their personal fucking opinions.
I won't mention names, but several very prominent advocates come to mind who, in my view, just simply do not meet diagnostic criteria for autism. I won't mention names, but there are those quote-unquote autistic doctors. Of course, I don't see a speck of autism in these people, but whatever. Who
What fucking place does opinion have in terms of science in the first place? That's such an obvious fucking point that I didn't even address it in my previous episode. Fuck you 3.
Number 3.
It seems that a lot of people, rather than perhaps looking more deeply at the crux of the issues that they're experiencing, have happily taken on this moniker of autism as something that explains the challenges that they feel that they have, and that they can also like pawn off as like a very positive thing.
Pawn off as a positive thing. You're really going to use the vocabulary of theft, of fencing stolen property, to describe even clinically diagnosed disabled people who are discussing their own challenges. Fuck you, Lee. I really can't believe you're in a position of leadership at a hospital for disabled children.
And I think it gives people kind of like a lot of an out in like a way to take on this term and erase any type of negativity or association of a challenge, and that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
And out. Erasing any sense of a challenge? Fuck you, Lee. You just described these people for allegedly pawning off their challenges as positives, for daring to discuss how they're working to overcome these challenges and pursue careers. These autistic people do extensively discuss their challenges, and this very Spectrum News article that you and your fucked up friends are saying these things in response to, an article that your coward-ass president, Jill Escher, only read the first 9% of, clearing the way for you and Carmen to accuse this article and the people in it of refusing to discuss challenges related to autism, when in reality, you just fucking refuse to read any of it. That's called lying, Lee, and you may think it's okay for a good person to lie, if it's for a good reason. But Lee, not only are you not a good person, but publicly denouncing disabled people because you're personally upset that they're pursuing prestigious careers in your field of employment is not a good reason. Fuck you.
Number 2.
Number 2. Now this is something special. Jill wants to call out the United States Centers for Disease Control because they posted messages to their website one fine April about helping autistic people reach their full potential during Autism Month. Unfortunately for the CDC, they made the mistakes of not only mentioning neurodiversity, but discussing helping autistic people reach their potential, including certain things that Jill's 2 autistic children can't do, evidently. And with Jill Escher herself being the main character of autism, that's not acceptable to her.
Join us as we raise awareness to promote autism acceptance, celebrate neurodiversity and individual differences, and continue to advance inclusivity and connectedness throughout the community. It's time to renew our commitment to honor the unique lived experiences of people with autism. Working together, we can support young families as well as children and youth with autism as they transition to adulthood, helping each individual reach their full potential. Oh, thank you for the platitudes.
Fuck you.
Fuck you.
Fuck you.
Oh, thank you for the platitudes. But yes, the CDC, we taxpayers put money into the CDC and into the NIH because we care about this rising tide of serious mental disorders, serious mental disability. We are not giving money to them to celebrate our children's disabilities, right? These are supposed to be serious organizations attacking serious public health issues. And instead, it's like our money is going into blah, 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 individual differences. No. This is not what we need. This is not what the country needs. The country needs serious work on understanding what WTF is happening and why 3% of all kids have abnormal neurodevelopment that rises to the level of autism. Anyway, I'm not going to rant anymore because we should go on.
This little blurb that you read is talking about the quirky people like me, and your kids are being left behind.
You're reaching your full potential. I mean, come on. And then here it says, partner with us. And here are all the hashtags. Autism Acceptance Month, neurodiversity. My kids don't have neurodiversity. They have serious mental disorder. Serious neurodevelopmental disorder. Their brains were formed improperly and abnormally. We should be calling it what it is.
Jill, you not only use the terms mental disorder and neurodevelopmental disorder interchangeably here, which is already objectively fucking wrong, especially for someone who presents themselves as an autism expert, but your use of the word neurodiversity reflects an understanding that the neurodiversity paradigm considers autism itself to be a neurodiversity, much in the same way that someone who knows jack shit about video games might think that all game consoles are called Nintendos. That's not even why this moment is on the list. The actual home run bullshit is this right here.
These are supposed to be scientific organizations, and now all they're doing is using like romanticizing language that kind of normalizes patent disability.
It seems to me that Jill gets sincerely triggered by any association of the words natural or normal in regards to autism or disability for reasons I don't even blame her for, as the non-disabled parent of 2 children who for their lives as disabled people will always have extreme degrees of difficulty, turmoil, and suffering, extreme even within the context of disability in general. However, if Jill is going to deal with that by getting herself into the driver's seat of a disability advocacy nonprofit and using that power and authority to speak out against the normalization of disability, that alone is sufficient justification for the disability community to actively organize to, by any reasonable and legal means, dismantle any perception of trustworthiness enjoyed by Jill Escher and the NCSA, along with any capability for Jill and the NCSA to impact the lives or public perception of autistic or disabled people of any description.
These are supposed to be scientific organizations, and now all they're doing is using like romanticizing language that kind of normalizes patent disability.
This sentiment from Jill against the normalization of disability is so critically dangerous to disabled people that I'm willing to consider everything else I've said about Jill and the NCSA up to this point in my entire video series to be mere trivializing nitpicks over minor technical details in comparison to the seriousness of this.
And now all they're doing is using like romanticizing language that kind of normalizes patent disability.
Hey, Jill, you know what normalization of disability can look like? It can look like this. It looks like a sticker purchasable at many auto supply shops, whose sole purpose is to alert first responders arriving at the scene of a car crash that an autistic person may be on board who might not only be injured and frightened following a crash, but may be unable to follow or understand instructions and might misunderstand attempts by first responders to provide medical assistance or to evacuate them from a burning vehicle to be life-threatening. Stickers alerting first responders to the perils faced by people such as that is the normalization of disability. You know what else is normalization of disability, Jill? Road signs warning that an autistic child lives in that area and might elope onto the road with no sense of warning or danger and get hit by a car. Jill, in episode 39 of your podcast, the main podcast I've been criticizing for the last 13 hours, Dr. Lopez Arvizu used examples of autistic people and their families who face this peril and uncertainty as a daily reality. These are people who could benefit from a sign exactly like this. But for some impossibly mean reason, Dr. Arvizu said this to admonish Spectrum News for supposedly being biased against lower functioning autistic people because they published an article about people who described themselves as high functioning, who were allegedly dominating the autism conversation simply by being discussed in an article at all.
There's so many of the people we serve that will never be able to even understand what a word doctor is. So that is what the conversation should be about. You know, if we're going to define this, or if it's defined as a spectrum, then allow the needle of the spectrum to move. and allow both extremes and the ones that are in the middle to be able to have a voice as well. Do not dominate the conversation, because that is what bias is. And that's something that we don't talk about enough in this kind of articles like the Spectrum publishes. It is the bias. You are absolutely writing all these documents with the bias that autism is something that is just a difference. And that is not what we see in the population we serve. And, very often I tell the parents of many of my patients, I do not know how it is to live the life you live, because I don't know. I have a semblance of an idea, but I'm not the one taking care of your child 24/7. I'm not the one that is terrified that maybe, somebody's going to get out of the house and walk across the freeway, or worse, be arrested or shot because somebody thinks they're on drugs and trying to rob me. So there's no way, even though I take care of these families and these patients, there is no way I can speak for them, because I do not live the way they do. So this bias and this extremism on both sides of the spectrum has to stop to really be of service for the population that we serve.
So I'm curious, you guys, you've had long careers in medicine. How many doctors have you met who you would diagnose with autism?
None.
The one in, what was that, Grey's Anatomy? There was one.
Oh, the one on TV.
Yeah.
The TV doctor, right, who doesn't exist in real life.
That was a hell of a response to a Spectrum news story about workplace discrimination against higher functioning autistic people, as the NCSA loves to call them, and who in this case, one of the people in the article itself described themselves using those terms. Either way, roadsides like this one are another example of the normalization of disability, Jill, and they directly address a concern your own NCSA ally and podcast panelist Dr. Arvizu expressed on your show. So Jill, given your opposition to the normalization of disability, how come both of the most obvious examples of normalization of autism that appear in people's daily lives happen to have been implemented specifically for the benefit and protection of people within the more severe subcategories of the autism spectrum range that the NCSA was supposedly created specifically to fight for and to speak up for and provide with better conditions? Without normalization of autism, the standard societal response to seeing this sticker and sign isn't, how can I help a vulnerable member of my community who is dependent on outside support and understanding to survive? The response is instead likely to be, why aren't these people in an asylum instead of being out on the street putting undue stress on normal people who can actually contribute to society? Yet Jill is so fucking offended by messaging relating to autism that not only isn't strictly negative, but also includes people with less extensive support needs than her own children, that Jill is willing to make blanket statements against the normalization of disability. I don't care whatever dumb shit some critically uninformed neurodiversity hothead spammed you with on Twitter, Jill. You're dealing with me now. And when I say that your spiteful bullshit is a setback to autistic people, I'm not complaining because you voice the struggles of the most critically isolated and disadvantaged autistic people who you call severe cases. I'm drawing attention to the fact that you're so obsessed with fighting the idea of disability as normal or natural that you're willing to reject societal progress that specifically benefits the so described severely autistic people that the NCSA was supposed to be founded to help. And by the fucking way, Jill, if you're watching this, you might recognize that autistic passenger alert sticker for automobiles, because I got it from the NCSA's Wikipedia page, where you or someone supporting your group used it to illustrate difficulties autistic people face, and those families that the NCSA wants to support. And the funny thing about the NCSA's Wikipedia page, at least at the time that I found it, is that it's by far one of the most flagrantly self-promotional articles related to specific organizations that I've ever encountered on that site. I would go as far as to say that the NCSA's Wikipedia page does more to promote your causes and positions than the actual homepage of your own official website. And yet, Jill, if your stupid-ass podcast episodes, in the cases that I'm covering, were as even-handed as your own group's Wikipedia page in terms of not explicitly presenting so-called high-functioning autistic people as the enemies of your so-described lower-functioning autistic family members, I wouldn't have made any videos about how full of shit you and your group are, let alone more than 13.
Number 1.
Time for number 1. If you've been watching my video series up to this point, you'll know that members and allies of the National Council on Severe Autism tend to be outspokenly skeptical, if not outright hostile, toward the idea of what they might call self-diagnosis or self-identification of autism without professional involvement. I've neither argued for or against the validity of self-diagnosis within this series, or in my previous autism videos, but that's certainly a position Jill and her NCSA friends and allies have, if in case you somehow haven't noticed.
There was a very famous autistic, so-called autistic individual, self-proclaimed. She had we can prevent the negatives, especially in terms of self-diagnosis. Like self-diagnosis is fraught with limitations, and anybody can diagnose themselves based on social difficulties as having autism. Many of the people that really assume the diagnosis of autism, because many neurodiversity proponents that claim to be autistics are really not autistics. Okay, and you have to be very careful.
Not only diagnosed with autism by professionals, but also self-diagnosed and have adopted autism. It's become sadly almost like faddish to for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
What I'm referring to. And sometimes a lot of these people who are autistic are self-diagnosed. Some of the people who are most vocal, right, in the autism community have just...
Oftentimes we can find ourselves in a situation of blind acceptance of identity over reality, which again is so frustrating because nowhere else in medicine do we experience the same. And again, these diagnoses are important because diagnoses dictate assessment, they dictate treatment, they dictate research, they dictate investigations. Patients with other issues don't get to choose their diagnosis. You don't get to choose what stage or grade of cancer you have. You don't get to choose your blood pressure, your laboratory values. You want your sodium level to be something. And no patient in his right mind would argue that that's how it should be. No cancer patient would want to grade or stage his own tumor based on his personal preference or his feelings or his identity.
With that well established, the number 1 item on my list is the only thing that isn't a video clip. It's a message posted by the official NCSA Facebook page that opens as follows. And I quote,
Many self-identified, meaning with or without an actual diagnosis, autistic adults claim they're just as effective at communication as everyone else.
No. Stop right there. Whatever else you have to say doesn't matter anymore. You finally just explicitly proved to me that the NCSA embraces a position in which they consider the professional, formal diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder in adults to somehow be a form of self-identification if the people in question are able to publish messages contrary to those of the NCSA. Now, I don't know if Jill wrote that, or if Lee wrote that, or if Amy or Jackie wrote that, or if it was someone else entirely. But it was posted by the official NCSA account, and I'd like to officially thank them for enabling me to confirm things that I was only able to imply or suggest before this point, because I always felt like the NCSA was treating diagnosis of autism in people they aren't personally invested in representing or assisting to be inherently lacking in credibility. But now you've outright proved it for me. The National Council on Severe Autism literally considers professional diagnosis of autism as a form of self-diagnosis if the person in question is an adult outside of the description the NCSA considers severe autism. I really don't know how it's possible that these people continuously manage to disappoint me, but they do, time and time again. And you may not believe it, but in spite of how obviously pissed off I've been at the NCSA, particularly Jill Escher and Lee Wachtel, up to this moment, I've actually been setting up a narrative throughout these videos of mine that left open the possibility for a redemption arc for the NCSA, in which their leadership could potentially get their shit together and stop treating autistic people other than their own children and patients as ideologically extreme disability fraudster villains who are the natural enemies of so-called true autistic people. But no, knowing what I know now, I can't even do that anymore. You know, I discovered this Facebook post after I already filmed everything else in the video prior to me mentioning it. It was actually a surprise development in my preparation of this project. Not just this video, but the entire series. Because I already sincerely believe that certain personalities within NCSA leadership, like Jill Escher and Lee Wachtel, had an ugly, explicit prejudice toward autistic people they considered high-functioning, and I understood that they were using the NCSA to actively promote dislike and distrust of us within the scientific community, the healthcare community, and amongst the general public. But I still held myself back from saying so much of what I could have said over a dozen videos ago. Things I held back out of fear of setting back any parents of disabled people who didn't have these biases against autistic people other than their own children. Not anymore. I have to prepare anyone who's been watching my videos by warning them that in my final few remaining videos, I'm going to be pulling back the curtain on the NCSA to reveal some seriously heinous misconduct, not in regards to any secret information I've uncovered about their dealings, but about obvious, plain as day, unhinged, prejudiced, malicious bullshit that the NCSA has been getting away with in spite of a total absence of subterfuge, in a way that I'm astounded isn't being widely spoken of already by neurodiversity proponents and autistic self-advocates, a few of whom seem too busy shitting out garbage like this to actually pay attention and hold the NCSA accountable in a meaningful way. So if you're an NCSA member who is only interested in organizing to advance the interests of high support needs autistic family members or patients of yours, I don't dislike you, and I'm not your enemy. However, unless you hate autistic people other than your own children and patients, unless you want to encourage necessary disability supports, including life-saving mental health care and career-enabling occupational therapy, accommodations, aids, and tools to be denied and withdrawn from us, unless you think it's funny when we as autistic people discuss our pain and suffering, unless you want to ridicule and denounce us in public when we lose our careers and our lives to ongoing societal stigma against autistic people who are able to, with supports in place, attempt self-sustaining careers later in life. Unless you're the kind of disability bigot who approves of and celebrates any of that crap I just described, you either need to stage a mutiny and seize control of the NCSA to kick out the proven bigots like Jill Escher and Lee Wachtel, or you need to quit the NCSA right now and start a new group that isn't run by discriminatory, desecrating, metaphysical bandit vandals. Because if you think the NCSA is your best chance of making things better for your autistic loved ones, you need to realize that the grim depths of their behavior at the leadership level is inexcusable to a point where it'll discredit any good thing that you think the NCSA may be capable of accomplishing. The NCSA, in my personal opinion, is the Harvey Dent of autism advocacy, and I'm going to show you how two-faced they really are. The question is, does their one hand know what the other's doing? We'll explore that next time in my next barrier aggression video, and thanks for watching.
Officer, these ruffians are trespassing in my swimming pool. As a tax-paying town resident, I demand you move them immediately.
This is not your pool, ma'am. This is a public pool. Your complaint is therefore nonsensical at a fundamental level.
Exactly. This pool is for town residents only. People like that don't belong here stealing our public resources.
Ma'am, those people are all town residents. Your complaint is therefore nonsensical at a fundamental level.
How do you know that?
Because I checked their ID cards and they all have home addresses within this town. Your complaint is therefore nonsensical at a fundamental level.
That's not my problem. I want you to kick them out at once for trespassing. This pool is for town residents only.
But they are town residents. They live and work in this town and have official documentation that they live here. Your complaint is therefore nonsensical at a fundamental level.
That's not fair. They are trespassing and getting away with it. They can't just claim to be town residents just because they reside in this town and have documentation saying they live here.
But that's how the rules work.
Well, can't you just make shit up and change the rules so I can have my way?
Number. And as a matter of fact, you are starting to sound like a crazy dumbass that just makes shit up so that you can have your way, which generally is considered a negative characteristic for someone to have.
Oh my, I am God 1997. Are you saying bad things about me?
Yes.
How dare you not give me what I want? Just wait until I talk to your police chief big time, oh baby.
I am the chief of police and captain of this house.
You are canceling me and violating my human rights as Murican. Not in my opinion, you are not the chef of police, you nuts and disrespectful bad boy. I think you only identify as a police chief. I'm putting you under citizen's arrest for impersonating an officer and committing communism.
Ma'am, put your hands behind your back. Big timer right now. Oh, bye-bye, baby. How did it stop? What do?